The man who commanded every role from Malcolm X to Training Day's corrupt detective hasn't directed a film in 8 years because his hands shake too badly to hold a camera steady. Denzel Washington, who built an empire on discipline and perfection, now takes medication every 4 hours for essential tremor he's hidden since 2016, wearing specially weighted watches to minimize the visible shaking during interviews. Behind that commanding presence lies a man who lost his best friend Chadwick Boseman without ever knowing he was sick, who spent decades estranged from his father before a deathbed reconciliation, and who admits he wasted years of his life in an alcoholic haze he can barely remember. What you're about to discover will shatter the image of Hollywood's most controlled actor. The man who never broke character has been breaking apart for years. If Denzel Washington ever made you believe in justice, leave a like and subscribe below. There's a moment in Denzel Washington's childhood that explains everything. Watching his parents sign divorce papers when he was 14, his father walking out of their Mount Vernon home, and his mother immediately sending him to Oakland Military Academy because she knew the streets would swallow him otherwise. Long before the world would know him as Hollywood's most disciplined actor, he was Denzel Hayes Washington Jr., learning that fathers could be present but absent, that love could exist alongside abandonment, and that discipline might be the only thing standing between success and destruction. Denzel was born on December 28, 1954, in Mount Vernon, New York, to Lennis, a beautician who owned her own shop, and Denzel Sr., a Pentecostal minister who worked 2 jobs during the week to support his family's middle-class existence. The Washington household appeared stable from outside. Church 3 times a week, dinner at 6 sharp, children in pressed clothes. But beneath the respectability, fractures were widening. Denzel Sr. was physically present, but emotionally unavailable. A man who could preach salvation on Sundays, but couldn't tell his son he loved him on Monday. "My father was a decent man, but he wasn't there," Denzel would later reflect. "He was in the house, but he wasn't present." There's a difference between being a father and being a daddy. The minister who counseled his congregation couldn't communicate with his own children, leaving young Denzel to wonder what he'd done wrong to deserve such distance. When the divorce came in 1968, 14-year-old Denzel was running with a group headed toward destruction. His closest friends would later die from violence or serve life sentences, futures his mother saw coming. Lennis made a decision that saved her son's life. She sent him to Oakland Military Academy in New Windsor, New York, using her entire savings. "My mother didn't send me there to punish me," Denzel explained decades later. "She sent me there to save me. I was angry about it for years, but she saw what I couldn't, that discipline would be my salvation." Oakland Military Academy was culture shock for a kid from Mount Vernon. 5 a.m. wake-ups, inspection lines, demerits for wrinkled sheets, push-ups for looking wrong. But something in that structure clicked for Denzel. The chaos inside him met external order and found balance. "I learned that discipline wasn't punishment," he reflected. "It was freedom. When you control yourself, nobody else can control you." He excelled academically for the first time, played sports with focus he'd never had, and discovered acting in the school's drama program, the one place where emotional expression was encouraged rather than suppressed. His mother, Lennis, worked 18-hour days to pay for the academy, doing hair until her hands cramped, never complaining, never asking for recognition. She'd visit monthly, bringing homemade food and tough love, reminding Denzel that he had one chance to be different from the statistics Mount Vernon was producing. "My mother saved me," Denzel would say simply. "My father leaving was the best thing that happened because it forced my mother to make hard decisions." The abandonment by his father created a wound that would never fully heal, a need to be perfect, to never give anyone reason to leave, to control every variable so disappointment couldn't surprise him. The boy who'd watched his father choose absence would become the man who showed up for everything, who never missed work, who built a career on reliability. But first, he had to survive the rage of being sent away, the confusion of being saved through exile, and the realization that sometimes love looks like discipline and salvation feels like abandonment. At 25, Denzel Washington stood outside the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles in 1979, having just been fired from a production for taking the character too seriously and refusing to play what he called the happy Negro the director wanted. He'd graduated from Fordham University with a BA in drama and journalism, then earned his master's from the American Conservatory Theater, but Hollywood didn't care about his education. They saw a black actor who wouldn't dance when they played the music. He was living in a studio apartment in Inglewood, working as a garbage collector at night to pay rent, auditioning during the day for roles that required him to be criminals, slaves, or servants. There was no plan B, he would later admit. Either I acted with dignity or I didn't act at all. Those were the only options I gave myself. Those first years were exercises in specific rejection. Denzel's training at ACT had taught him Shakespeare, Chekhov, and method acting, but casting directors wanted him to be more street, sound less educated, act more black in ways that meant stereotypes. One particularly brutal audition for a television show ended with the director saying, "You sound like you think you're white. We need authentic." He auditioned for over 200 roles between 1977 and 1980, landing exactly 5, all single-episode television appearances, where he played criminals or victims, usually dying before the credits. The breakthrough from invisibility came through theater, the only place that would let him act rather than perform race. Joseph Papp saw him in a small production and cast him in Coriolanus at the Public Theater, where Denzel played the title role opposite Morgan Freeman. "Theater saved me from becoming bitter," Denzel explained. "On stage, talent mattered more than type." He lived on $125 a week from the theater, supplementing with construction work, moving furniture, anything that paid, but left him free for evening performances. The real shift came through television, though it felt like compromise. St. Elsewhere in 1982 offered him Dr. Philip Chandler, a role that required him to be intelligent, complex, and fully human, revolutionary for a black character on network television. The producers had wanted someone safer, less intense, but Denzel auditioned 6 times, each time refusing to soften his interpretation. "I wasn't going to play a doctor who happened to be black," he said. "I was going to play a black doctor dealing with everything that meant." But fate's most important gift came through preparation that bordered on obsession. For A Soldier's Story in 1984, Denzel lost 30 pounds, lived on military bases, and studied the specific ways segregation had broken black soldiers psychologically. He didn't just memorize lines. He researched the real unit the story was based on, interviewed veterans, understood the weight of playing men who'd fought for a country that didn't want them. Director Norman Jewison later said, "Denzel didn't act in that film. He channeled something ancestral." The role led to Cry Freedom in 1987, his first Oscar nomination, playing Steve Biko opposite Kevin Kline. But even that triumph came with humiliation. Kline received top billing and higher pay, despite Denzel playing the title character. "I learned that excellence wasn't enough," Denzel reflected. "You had to be twice as good to get half as much. And even then, they'd find ways to remind you of your place." He took the lesson and weaponized it. If he had to be twice as good, he'd be 10 times better. The garbage collector who wouldn't shuffle was about to become undeniable. The role of Private Trip in Glory wasn't supposed to transform Denzel Washington into a star. He was the 4th choice for a supporting role in a Civil War film that studios considered uncommercial. playing an escaped slave alongside Matthew Broderick, who had top billing. Director Edward Zwick had wanted Wesley Snipes, then considered Lou Gossett Jr., before Denzel auditioned with such intensity that Zwick later said, "He didn't read for the part, he possessed it." Denzel had exactly 6 weeks to prepare, researching not just Civil War history, but the specific psychology of men who'd been enslaved, studying how trauma lived in the body, how freedom could feel like another kind of prison when you'd never been allowed to imagine it. Behind the scenes, Denzel was channeling generations of suppressed rage into Private Trip. The famous whipping scene required him to be shirtless, showing scars that makeup created, but that Denzel imagined came from his own ancestors. He insisted on being actually struck during rehearsals to understand the physicality of enduring violence without breaking. "I wasn't acting in that scene," Denzel later admitted. "I was letting out something I'd carried my whole life. The anger of being seen as less than human, of having to prove you deserve dignity." The single tear that rolls down his face during the whipping wasn't scripted. It was Denzel breaking through his own control. The physical preparation bordered on dangerous. Denzel trained with Civil War reenactors, learning to march with period equipment until his feet bled, drilling with rifles until he could load and fire without thinking. He stayed in character between takes, refusing to break Tripp's anger even during meals, alienating cast members who didn't understand his method. Morgan Freeman, playing Sergeant Major Rawlins, later revealed, "Denzel was fighting a war we couldn't see." He'd isolated himself so completely that reaching him required entering his battlefield. When Glory released in December 1989, Denzel's 17 minutes of screen time overshadowed everything else. Critics who'd never particularly noticed him suddenly couldn't stop writing about the power of his performance. Roger Ebert called him devastating, while the New York Times declared he'd given the film soul and its rage. The performance earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, making him the second black actor ever to win an Oscar. Standing on that stage, holding the statue, Denzel felt not triumph, but pressure. Now he had to prove it wasn't a fluke. But even at this pinnacle moment, Denzel struggled with what the role had cost him. "I had to become someone filled with hate to show love," he reflected. "I had to embody degradation to demonstrate dignity." The Oscar was recognition, but it was also a reminder that I had to suffer publicly for art to matter. The breakthrough triggered his need for even more control. If emotion made him excellent, then he'd control every emotion. If pain made him believable, then he'd master pain. The role that made him a star also taught him that excellence required excavating wounds, that Academy Awards came from places that never fully healed. The man who'd refused to shuffle had won by showing the cost of being forced to. But the price was carrying Private Trip's rage long after cameras stopped rolling, wondering if every role would require him to bleed for authenticity, if success meant performing trauma for audiences who wanted to see him suffer beautifully. The Oscar sat on his shelf, but the weight sat on his shoulders. Now he had to be excellent every time, because being good wasn't enough for a black actor with a golden statue. By 2001, Denzel Washington wasn't just a movie star. He was Hollywood's most respected actor, commanding $20 million per film after winning Best Actor for Training Day, becoming only the second black actor to win the lead acting Oscar. His production company, Mundy Lane Entertainment, gave him creative control over projects that studios now begged him to join. He owned properties worth $40 million, including a Beverly Hills mansion and a sprawling New York estate. The man who'd been told he was too serious was now directing films, producing projects, and mentoring young black actors who saw him as proof that excellence could overcome exclusion. But even at this impossible height, Denzel was battling demons he'd hidden behind discipline, a drinking problem that started as celebration and became medication. The public saw triumph after triumph, Malcolm X, earning him another Oscar nomination and critical acclaim. The Hurricane, proving he could carry biographical films. Training Day, showing he could play darkness as convincingly as dignity. But privately, Denzel was exhausting himself maintaining perfection. He'd arrive on sets having memorized not just his lines, but the entire script, unable to tolerate any deviation from preparation. Between takes, he'd disappear to his trailer. What crews assumed was meditation was often Denzel drinking wine to calm anxiety he'd never acknowledge. "I had everything except peace," he would later admit in a rare moment of honesty. Success meant more pressure to never fail, never disappoint, never be less than perfect. The relationship with his wife Pauletta was strong, but strained by his increasing absence. Not just physical, but emotional. They'd been married since 1983, raised 4 children together, but Denzel's need for control extended to family life. He scheduled family time like scenes, planned conversations like dialogue, treated spontaneity as danger. His son John David would later reveal that dinner felt like being directed by Dad. Everything had purpose, nothing was casual. Denzel provided everything materially, but struggled with emotional availability, repeating his father's pattern despite swearing he'd be different. Working with directors like Spike Lee, Tony Scott, and Antoine Fuqua, Denzel became known as the most prepared actor in Hollywood, arriving weeks early for rehearsal, staying late to perfect takes, never satisfied with good enough. What they didn't know was this perfectionism came from terror of being exposed as imperfect. He'd spend nights reviewing dailies, finding flaws invisible to others, demanding reshoots for moments only he noticed. "Excellence is the only option when you're representing more than yourself," he told Jamie Foxx during Collateral filming. "Every role I take, I'm carrying my community's hopes." "Success is the loneliest place," Denzel once told his pastor during this period. "Everyone sees you as having everything, so you can't admit you're empty." By 2002, at the absolute peak of his powers, Denzel Washington had 2 Oscars, universal respect, and the kind of legacy that transcended race in an industry still struggling with equality. But he also had a drinking problem he wouldn't address for another decade, a relationship with his father that remained broken, and the exhausting burden of being Hollywood's good one. The black actor who never caused problems, never complained, never showed weakness. The statue for Training Day sat on his shelf, but he later admitted he barely remembered winning it, having been in a fog from wine and exhaustion. But even at the height of everything, cracks were forming that would take years to fully reveal. Denzel's marriage to Pauletta Pearson in 1983 began with mutual understanding. She was an accomplished actress and singer who understood the industry's demands. He was a rising actor who promised partnership rather than possession. They married after meeting on the set of Wilma in 1977, Denzel proposing 3 times before Pauletta said yes because she wanted to be sure he understood marriage meant consistency, not performance. "I thought I'd found my equal," Denzel would later reflect. "Someone who wouldn't let me hide behind excellence, who'd demand presence, not just presence." They had 4 children, John David in 1984, Kadia in 1986, twins Olivia and Malcolm in 1991, creating what appeared to be Hollywood's most stable family, a rarity for any actor, nearly impossible for a black family in entertainment. But behind the public perfection, Denzel was repeating patterns he'd sworn to break. His father's emotional absence manifested differently, but equally, Denzel was physically present, but emotionally fortified, providing everything materially while struggling with vulnerability. He'd schedule family time between films, but spend it directing rather than connecting, organizing activities rather than allowing organic moments. "Dad was there, but not there," his son John David would later say carefully. "He gave us everything accept the messy, imperfect parts of himself. Pauletta managed the emotional labor, translating Denzel's love through his absence, explaining why Daddy showed affection through provision rather than presence. The marriage survived, but struggled through Denzel's drinking years, roughly 1999 to 2012, when wine became his medication for anxiety he wouldn't acknowledge. Pauletta would find empty bottles hidden in his study, confront him gently, only to meet defensive anger. "I was functional," Denzel admitted years later. "I never missed work, never embarrassed my family publicly, so I convinced myself it wasn't a problem." But Pauletta knew. She always knew. She gave him space to find his bottom, refusing to enable but not abandoning, a delicate balance that exhausted her while she maintained their public image. The turning point came in 2012, when Denzel, now sober, finally understood the cost of his controlled distance. Pauletta had been essentially a single parent to 4 children while married to one of Hollywood's most successful actors. She'd sacrificed her own career, managed his anxiety without acknowledgement, and created stability from his chaos. "I married Denzel Washington, the man, not the actor," she told him during a particularly honest conversation. "But somewhere along the way, you became the performance full-time." The pattern with his children revealed similar struggles. John David became an actor, despite Denzel initially forbidding it, not from cruelty, but from protection. He knew the cost of excellence and wanted to spare his son. The twins pursued their own paths, partly to escape their father's shadow. Katia became a producer, working behind cameras, where the Washington name meant less. "I gave them everything except permission to fail," Denzel reflected. "I thought I was protecting them, but I was suffocating them with expectation." Love isn't perfection, Denzel finally understood in his 60s. It's presence. It's letting people see you struggle, fail, be human. I spent 40 years trying to be perfect for my family when all they wanted was real. The marriage survived, 41 years and counting, but it bears scars from decades of Denzel choosing control over connection, excellence over intimacy. Pauletta stayed not because it was easy, but because she saw the man Denzel could be when he stopped performing. Rare glimpses that suggested the boy from Mount Vernon still existed beneath the accumulated armor of achievement. In 2016, during a Broadway performance of The Iceman Cometh, Denzel Washington's right hand began trembling uncontrollably as he held a glass, the liquid spilling across the stage while he continued delivering lines, hoping the audience would attribute it to character choice rather than medical reality. The diagnosis came after months of denial: essential tremor, a neurological condition causing involuntary shaking that worsens with stress, age, and ironically, the attempt to control it. Doctors explained it was progressive, likely hereditary, and while not life-threatening, it would affect his ability to perform precise movements. "My body betrayed me," Denzel told his wife Pauletta that night. "The thing I've controlled my entire life decided to remind me I was never really in control." The exact medical reality was more complex than simple tremor. Years of suppressed stress, decades of perfectionism, and the physical toll of method acting had created a perfect storm in his nervous system. The tremor was worst in his dominant hand, but could affect his voice during emotional scenes, his legs during extended standing. Doctors prescribed beta blockers to manage symptoms, but they affected his energy and memory. Denzel had to choose between controlling the tremor and maintaining the mental sharpness his performances required. He chose to manage without medication during filming, using weighted props, strategic blocking, and careful editing to hide the shaking. The physical adaptations became elaborate choreography. Denzel would grip objects with both hands to steady them, lean against furniture during dialogue, keep his hands in pockets or holding stable objects. During the Equalizer 2 filming, fight scenes required multiple takes and digital assistance to remove visible tremoring. He couldn't hold guns steady for close-ups, couldn't pour drinks without spilling, couldn't write on camera without revealing the shake. Every scene became a negotiation with my body, he explained to director Antoine Fuqua, planning how to hide what I couldn't control. The condition forced Denzel to confront his relationship with control itself. The man who'd built a career on precision, who'd never missed a mark or forgotten a line, now couldn't trust his own hands. He stopped directing after Fences in 2016, unable to hold cameras steady for the intimate shots he preferred. The tremor worsened with caffeine, lack of sleep, and stress, all constants in film production. He had to restructure his entire approach to acting, learning to work with his body's rebellion rather than against it. Recovery wasn't possible. Management became the goal. Denzel's daily routine now included hand exercises to maintain flexibility, meditation to manage stress that triggered tremoring, and careful scheduling around his body's patterns. The tremor was minimal in early mornings, worst by evening, so filming schedules were adjusted accordingly. He learned to eat before public events to avoid the humiliation of shaking utensils, to sign autographs with his arm braced against his body, to shake hands quickly before tremoring became noticeable. The diagnosis was almost liberating, Denzel admitted to his pastor. I'd spent 60 years trying to be perfect. Now my body made perfection impossible. I had to choose between hiding or admitting I was human. The public response when he finally acknowledged the condition was supportive, but Denzel struggled with being seen as vulnerable. The essential tremor became a visible reminder that control was illusion, that bodies rebel regardless of discipline, that even Denzel Washington couldn't direct his own nervous system. The man who'd embodied strength on screen now demonstrated that strength sometimes means accepting what you cannot change. The call came at 6:30 a.m. on April 28, 1991, while Denzel was filming Malcolm X in Cairo, his brother David's voice breaking as he delivered news that would haunt Denzel for decades. Their father, Denzel Sr., had died of a heart attack at 61, alone in his Virginia apartment, undiscovered for 2 days. The man who'd walked out when Denzel was 14, who'd been absent for every major achievement, every award, every milestone, was gone before reconciliation could happen. I stood in that hotel room in Egypt, Denzel would later tell his pastor, realizing I'd been waiting 27 years for a conversation that would never come. He died without ever saying he was proud of me. The history between father and son was complicated by time and silence. After the divorce, Denzel Sr. had remarried, started another family, and maintained minimal contact with his first children. He'd send birthday cards with $5 bills, make occasional phone calls that lasted minutes, show up to graduations, but leave before celebrations. When Denzel won his first Oscar for Glory, his father sent a congratulations card through the mail rather than calling. He could acknowledge my success to others, Denzel reflected, but never to me directly. The funeral in Mount Vernon was surreal. Denzel, now a movie star worth millions, standing beside half-siblings he barely knew, mourning a man who'd been more concept than presence. He delivered no eulogy. What could he say about someone who'd been physically absent and emotionally unavailable, even when present? The service was filled with people describing a Denzel Sr. that his son didn't recognize, church members calling him devoted, coworkers calling him reliable. I realized I was mourning not who he was, but who he never was to me, Denzel said. What followed was Denzel's reckoning with inherited patterns. He saw how his father's emotional absence had manifested in his own parenting, different in form, but similar in impact. The control, the distance, the inability to be vulnerable, all traced back to that 14-year-old boy watching his father leave. I spent my life proving I was worthy of a love that was never coming, Denzel told Pauletta after the funeral. Every role, every award was me trying to earn approval from a ghost. The aftermath revealed how deeply the abandonment had shaped him. Denzel threw himself into Malcolm X with new intensity, finding parallels between Malcolm's absent father and his own. He began therapy for the first time, confronting decades of suppressed anger. The drinking increased as he medicated feelings he'd never allowed himself to feel. His mother, Lennis, who'd saved him through discipline, watched her son grieve a man who'd contributed nothing but absence. My father's death taught me that some reconciliations happen only in your heart, Denzel reflected years later. I had to forgive him not for his sake. He was gone, but for mine. I had to stop performing for an audience that was never watching. The loss wasn't just of his father, but of the fantasy that someday they'd have the conversation where everything made sense, where abandonment was explained, where pride was finally expressed. Instead, Denzel was left with silence, the same gift his father had always given, now permanent. By 2012, Denzel Washington sat atop a fortune worth $220 million, commanded $20 million per film, and had just directed Fences on Broadway to critical acclaim while planning its film adaptation. But what the world didn't know was that Denzel had discovered massive financial irregularities in his accounts. His business manager had been mismanaging funds for years, not through theft, but through risky investments Denzel never approved, resulting in losses estimated at $30 million. The revelation came during routine tax preparation, when accountants found discrepancies between reported income and actual holdings. I went from wealthy to realizing I'd been sleepwalking through my finances, Denzel told his lawyer. Success made me lazy about monitoring my own money. The career impact of his essential tremor diagnosis in 2016 was carefully managed but significant. Insurance companies now required extensive medical examinations, adding millions to production costs. His quote didn't drop, but the types of roles offered changed. Fewer action sequences, more stationary dramatic parts. Directors who once competed for him now hesitated, worried about the tremor's visibility. I went from Denzel Washington to Denzel Washington with limitations, he observed. Same name, different market value. Behind the scenes, Denzel had to restructure his entire financial approach. He discovered he'd been supporting extended family members without tracking the drain. Cousins, distant relatives, church members from his father's congregation who remembered him as Little Denzel. The monthly outflow exceeded $200,000 for people he hadn't seen in years. The business manager's mismanagement forced him to cut off many dependents, creating family rifts and accusations of abandonment. Success means everyone thinks you owe them, he explained. When you stop paying, you discover who actually cared about you versus your checkbook. The survival tactics required Denzel to work more as his body cooperated less. He took franchise films like the Equalizer series for financial security rather than artistic merit, guaranteed paydays that didn't depend on box office performance. He increased commercial work, lending his voice to projects he'd have rejected at his peak. The Broadway revival of The Iceman Cometh in 2018 paid relatively little but proved he could still perform, despite the tremor, rebuilding confidence with insurance companies. The slow rebuild revealed how precarious even massive success could be. Denzel's production company scaled back, focusing on smaller projects with controlled budgets rather than ambitious films. He sold several properties, including a mansion in Los Angeles and land in Texas he'd forgotten owning. The financial restructuring wasn't about poverty, he remained wealthy, but about confronting how disconnected he'd become from his own empire. Rock bottom for me wasn't losing money, he explained. It was realizing I'd been successful without being conscious, wealthy without being aware. By 2020, he'd stabilized through careful management and selective projects, But the experience had taught him that control was illusion, whether over his body or his bank accounts. By 2024, Denzel Washington's appearance at the Academy Awards became notable when he required assistance walking up the stairs, his essential tremor now visible despite medication. His left hand showing slight contracture he couldn't fully hide. What the public didn't know was that Denzel had been experiencing cognitive changes he attributed to age, but doctors suspected were related to long-term stress and his years of alcohol use, word-finding difficulties during interviews, occasional confusion about dates, and short-term memory issues that required extensive notes and assistance. At 69, he was still working, but each role required more support, more preparation time, and careful scheduling around his body's increasing limitations. The cognitive changes manifested in subtle but concerning ways. During the Equalizer 3 filming, Denzel would sometimes forget they'd already shot scenes, requiring diplomatic reminders from director Antoine Fuqua. He'd call co-stars by character names exclusively, unable to retain their real names. The famous preparation he was known for became impossible. He now required assistants to record lines he'd listened to repeatedly, his former photographic memory clouded. "We protect him," a crew member revealed. "We make it look effortless, but there's an entire system helping him maintain the illusion." Public speculation about his health became increasingly difficult to manage. Videos analyzing his tremor, his gait, his cognitive pauses went viral regularly. Social media dissected every appearance, comparing recent interviews to older ones, diagnosing conditions from clips. When he appeared to struggle with a teleprompter at a charity event, hashtags about his decline trended for days. The man who'd embodied control and dignity was being reduced to inspiration porn. Still working at 69, as if mere presence was achievement. The isolation had deepened significantly. Denzel withdrew from social events, limited interviews to pre-recorded segments where editing could help, and communicated mainly through his team. Friends described him as present but guarded, maintaining distance even from those he'd known for decades. His children took turns staying with him, but he struggled with being dependent, the reversal of roles challenging his identity as provider and protector. Recent controversies only added to his challenges. Comments about modern filmmaking being too woke sparked backlash from younger actors who'd once idolized him. His defense of traditional masculinity in interviews was criticized as outdated. An awkward moment where he appeared confused during a podcast, repeating the same story twice, became a viral meme about aging. "I've become what I always feared," Denzel told John David during a vulnerable moment. "Someone people pity rather than respect." The work continued because work was identity. Voiceover projects that could be recorded in segments, limited theatrical runs where audiences came for legacy rather than performance, carefully managed appearances that maintained the illusion of the Denzel Washington everyone remembered. At 69, he'd become both icon and cautionary tale, proof that even the most disciplined careers, the most controlled personas, eventually face what cannot be controlled. The man who'd spent decades perfecting his craft was now crafting the appearance of perfection. Each performance potentially his last. Each appearance a careful negotiation between who he was and who he could still pretend to be. Today, at 69, Denzel Washington continues working through essential tremor that makes holding a script difficult, cognitive changes that require constant support, and the exhausting performance of being Denzel Washington when the man himself is increasingly uncertain who that is. He rises each morning in his Mount Vernon estate, takes medication that manages symptoms but doesn't restore what's lost, and prepares for another day of carefully managed appearances. His net worth remains substantial at approximately $280 million. His legacy secure with 2 Oscars and countless acclaimed performances. But he works now not for achievement, but for identity. Without the roles, without the preparation, without the discipline, who is he? The truth in Denzel's story. Perfection is a prison you build yourself, and sometimes the hardest role is admitting you're human. If this moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more stories revealing the cost of excellence.